I overheard my family planning to use me on Thanksgiving, so I disappeared and everything fell apart. A few days before Thanksgiving, I walked into the kitchen to refill my water bottle and heard my brother say something that made me stop cold. "She'll do it. She always does." My mom laughed. "Of course she will. Nora never tells us no." I pressed myself against the wall, heart tapping like a nervous finger. I wanted to believe I had misunderstood, but then my sister chimed in. "Perfect. She can watch all the kids upstairs. We'll finally get a peaceful Thanksgiving." Those words didn't just land in my ears, they settled in my bones. For a moment, the kitchen felt like a place I didn't belong. It was as though I had walked into a movie I was not allowed to act in, only serve behind the scenes. My stomach dipped with a mixture of recognition and disappointment because I wasn't shocked. Not really. I was used to being spoken about this way, described as the reliable one, the helper, the person whose time stretched to fit everyone else's needs. Still, hearing it so carelessly spoken aloud made something small inside me crack. My name is Nora. I'm 29 years old, and for most of my life my family has viewed me as the available one. I'm single, I don't have kids, and I live close enough to be convenient. Because of that combination, I've slowly become the person who fills the gaps other people leave behind. Babysitting at the last minute, handling errands when my siblings are overwhelmed, saying yes to tasks everyone else avoids. It didn't happen overnight. It grew quietly, like ivy creeping along a wall until suddenly the brick beneath it disappears. In my family's story, I eventually became the vines, useful, flexible, expected but never the wall. People outside my home never would have guessed any of this. At work, I'm the calm analyst who meets deadlines early and organizes projects efficiently. My apartment is neat, my bills are paid, my life looks independent and steady. But under that stability is a layer of exhaustion no spreadsheet could capture. It wasn't until this particular Thanksgiving approached that I finally let myself acknowledge how drained I had become. The pattern had formed slowly. When my siblings began starting their families, I became the aunt who always helped. It felt nice in the beginning. My nieces and nephews loved me with such uncomplicated affection that it softened me every time. I felt useful and trusted, and my parents praised me for being responsible. The problem wasn't the kids. It was the adults, the assumptions they piled on me without pause, the way my time was treated like a community shelf everyone else could take from. Saturday mornings were the clearest example. Nearly every weekend, I'd wake up hoping for a quiet day and instead get a text or knock from my sister explaining how overwhelmed she was and how much she needed. Just a few hours of help. I usually said yes, because the alternative came wrapped in guilt or disappointment. Those few hours often stretched into entire days, and I'd spend my weekends doing tasks that weren't mine. I told myself it was love. I told myself family did things for each other. But real family doesn't hide their expectations behind praise or assume someone else will pick up all the work. Real family doesn't treat your free time as their property. It was during one of those weekends in early November that I first felt the fog lift. I had spent all Saturday caring for my sister's kids. By the time she picked them up, the sun had already set, and I had barely eaten, barely rested, barely had time to breathe. When the door closed behind them, I sank into my couch with my body slack and tired. I looked at the clock and realized the entire day had slipped away. I couldn't even recall what I wanted to do with it. That evening, I made myself a promise. This Thanksgiving would be different. I would attend as a guest, not as the unpaid childcare provider. I would bring a dish, not a full day of responsibility. I would show up as Nora, the adult with her own life, not the default helper who existed for everyone else's convenience. But promises made in private are easy. Following through is harder, especially when you come from a family that has grown comfortable with your silence. When I heard their Thanksgiving plan from behind the kitchen wall, that crack inside me widened. I could have stepped into the room and confronted them, but I didn't trust my own voice yet. I simply walked backward until I reached the hallway, then slipped outside to the front porch, letting the cool air hit my face. The sky above was overcast, and a soft breeze carried the scent of dry leaves. I sat on the steps and let the disappointment pass through me. It came in waves: frustration, sadness, anger, then a slow acceptance. I had always known my family relied on me too much, but this was the first time I realized they relied on me blindly, thoughtlessly, without any awareness of my needs. That night, I went home replaying those overheard words in my head. It wasn't that they expected me to help. It was that they never considered I might not want to. They assumed my willingness instead of asking for my consent. They planned an entire holiday around my time without involving me. And worst of all, they imagined a peaceful Thanksgiving that required isolating me upstairs with a house full of children. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, thinking about all the Thanksgiving memories from my childhood. I remembered the smell of spices, the sound of laughter, everyone crowded around the dining table with plates full of the foods we only made once a year. I remembered helping my mom bake pies, watching my siblings sneak snacks when they thought no one was looking, all of us sharing stories and teasing each other. It used to be a holiday that brought us together. Somewhere along the way, Thanksgiving turned into an event that separated me from them. I became the person who set the table, soothed crying toddlers, took over when kids got restless, and slipped out of the dining room every time someone needed something. They had begun to treat me not as a participant, but as staff, realizing that hurt more deeply than I cared to admit. As the days moved closer to Thanksgiving, that overheard conversation stayed with me like a heavy stone pressed inside my chest. I tried to distract myself with work and errands, but the memory followed me everywhere. I found myself replaying moments from years before, noticing signs I'd brushed aside, the times I offered to help and was taken for granted, the times I expressed exhaustion and was told I was overthinking, the times I tried to set boundaries and was met with disappointment so thick it felt like emotional quicksand. I had allowed myself to become the one who never said no. And because I never said no, they assumed I never would. But something had changed this time. Something inside me refused to accept this version of Thanksgiving again. I wasn't yet ready to take action, but I was ready to think about it. And sometimes the willingness to think differently is the first step toward doing differently. With Thanksgiving fast approaching, I knew one thing for certain. The version of the holiday they envisioned and the version I needed could no longer coexist. This time, something was going to change. As Thanksgiving drew closer, the pressure around me thickened like the humid air before a storm. My family began preparing with their usual chaos, sending messages back and forth about groceries, guest lists, and plans for the day. Through all of it, my name slipped into conversations the same way salt slips into a recipe, automatically, without measuring, without thought. Every mention hinted at a task they quietly placed on my shoulders. I noticed it more now, each assumption clearer than ever, because once you hear people define your role behind your back, it becomes impossible to ignore the pattern in their later words. My siblings seemed to assume I already agreed to everything, and my mom dropped subtle comments about how thankful she was to have extra hands this year. To her, I wasn't her daughter coming home to enjoy the holiday. I was the reinforcement staff arriving early. What disturbed me most was how normal this felt to them. No one asked about my plans for Thanksgiving morning or whether I intended to visit a friend or rest before the gathering. No one asked if I had errands, work to finish, or even how I was doing. Their version of the event centered around their needs, and I was expected to be the flexible thread stitching everything together. In the past, I might have brushed off these observations, convincing myself that I was overthinking or being oversensitive. But that overheard conversation had stripped away the illusions I once used to comfort myself. It forced me to recognize a truth I had quietly avoided. My family treated my time as if it belonged to them. A few days after hearing their plan, my mother called me, sounding tired and stressed, describing how busy she was and how tough it would be to cook everything alone. She told me she needed help managing the food, keeping things organized, and getting everyone settled. She said these things with affection, making them sound like small favors, but I could hear the expectation humming beneath her words. She listed dishes she hoped I'd prepare or pick up, and she talked about the number of guests and how overwhelming it felt. Not once did she ask if I was comfortable doing all this. Not once did she ask if I wanted help myself. She simply said she knew I would make everything work because I always did. The call left me mentally drained. After hanging up, I stared at my kitchen counter, trying to sort through the mix of frustration and guilt swirling in my chest. For years, I convinced myself that stepping in was the right thing to do, that helping family was a responsibility, something unquestioned. But as I looked around my quiet apartment, I began noticing all the tiny sacrifices stacked up over time. The weekends I gave away, the outings with friends I canceled, the trips I postponed, the sleep I lost, the exhaustion I carried into Mondays. All of it had slowly bent me into a shape that fit their needs better than my own. What frustrated me wasn't the work, it was the assumption. The belief that my life was the one easiest to rearrange, that my responsibilities mattered less, that my adulthood was somehow lighter or simpler because I lived it alone. And that assumption dug deeper inside me than any chore or obligation ever could. About a week before Thanksgiving, I stopped by my parents' house to drop something off after work. The air smelled like the early stages of preparation, spices, onions sizzling, the faint scent of bread warming in the oven. My mother was in the kitchen, humming while stirring a pot. My siblings were in the living room, surrounded by scattered bags of decorations, making lists and sorting through supplies. It should have felt comforting, nostalgic even, but something about it made me oddly aware of my place in their system. I stood near the doorway, already anticipating the moment when they'd hand me a list or ask me to take on some task they hadn't planned for themselves. As expected, within minutes my sister mentioned they'd need someone to keep the kids upstairs while they focused on setting up. My brother chimed in about how loud and rowdy the younger cousins could be, and how great it would be if someone kept them occupied before dinner. My mom added something about how much easier the cooking would be if the house stayed calm. It didn't take long for all their comments to circle back to the same predictable point. I was the one who should manage the children, handle the activities, keep things smooth and quiet while they enjoyed a holiday they barely realized I wanted to participate in. I nodded politely and excused myself after a short while, claiming I had errands to run. When I returned home, the air felt heavy. I dropped my keys onto the counter and sat on the edge of my bed, letting the silence of my apartment settle around me. I thought about the version of Thanksgiving my family envisioned, them downstairs enjoying their conversations, laughter, and food, while I sat upstairs supervising a cluster of kids who weren't mine. I loved, the kids I cared for, but still children whose responsibility lay with their parents, not with me. Sitting there, I realized that for years Thanksgiving had been a holiday I participated in only in fragments. Quick bites of food, short conversations, glimpses of the celebration while I ran in and out of rooms to quiet tantrums or find missing toys. I remembered sitting with crying toddlers while the smells of turkey and sweet potatoes drifted through the doorway. I remembered listening to muffled laughter from downstairs while I convinced a restless child to nap. I remembered the sound of people clinking glasses and cheering for dessert while I scrubbed spilled juice from the carpet. At some point, I had stopped being part of the celebration and instead became part of the labor behind it. The realization washed over me with a mixture of sadness and clarity. I didn't want that again. Not this year. Maybe not ever again. I thought back to how my Thanksgiving plans used to look when I imagined my adult life. I pictured warm gatherings, meaningful conversations, moments of gratitude, maybe even a special dish I made with pride. I pictured being included, not assigned. I pictured standing around the kitchen laughing with my siblings, not being hidden away upstairs to manage chaos alone. The more I thought about it, the more I felt a quiet strength growing inside me. Not the strong, bold kind that bursts through obstacles, but the soft, steady kind that forms when you finally realize you deserve better. I wanted a Thanksgiving where I actually tasted the meal, where I actually sat at the table long enough to join the stories, where I wasn't so exhausted by childcare that the holiday passed by in a blur. I wanted a Thanksgiving that allowed me to feel like a daughter, a sister, an adult, not the unpaid support staff. 2 days later, I went to the grocery store to pick up a few things. While walking through the aisles, I noticed the shelves filled with pies, cranberry sauce, spices, and warm season ingredients. Normally, these displays would make me feel a bit sentimental, the kind of mild nostalgia that comes with remembering past holidays. But this time, they made me feel something different, a flicker of hope. Something whispered inside me that maybe this year I could carve out a moment for myself. Maybe I could do something I genuinely wanted instead of slipping into the role laid out for me. When I reached the checkout counter, I found myself buying something unexpected, a small seasonal candle labeled Quiet Evening. It smelled like cinnamon, vanilla, and something warm that reminded me of calm winter nights. I didn't know why I bought it in that moment, but when I got home and lit it, I understood. I wanted a Thanksgiving that didn't drain me. I wanted a Thanksgiving where I could sit still long enough to breathe. I realized then that wanting peace didn't make me selfish. It made me human. But wanting peace and claiming it were two different things. I'd spent years choosing the easier path: silence, compliance, acceptance. This time, walking the other direction would take more courage than I was used to showing. Yet, as the days inched closer, I felt something anchor itself inside me. Thanksgiving wasn't here yet, but the decision to change the pattern had already begun to take shape. What I didn't know was how much that decision would alter everything that followed. As Thanksgiving approached, the quiet determination I had been nurturing began to grow into something more solid. For the first time in years, I had allowed myself to question the script my family had written for me. And once that thread was pulled, the rest of the pattern started unraveling. Still, even with this new awareness, I didn't yet know what action I would take. All I knew was that I could not endure another holiday locked into the same unspoken job, drifting through the celebration like a ghost whose purpose was to make things convenient for everyone else. The turning point arrived unexpectedly, disguised as an ordinary moment. 3 days before Thanksgiving, I received a text from my cousin Maya. She lived several hours away, in a quiet town near the mountains, with a lifestyle that always seemed relaxed and peaceful. Her message was simple: a photo of a long table set out on her porch, decorated with pumpkins, candles, and autumn leaves, followed by the note that her mother insisted on preparing a practice table setup for their Thanksgiving dinner. Maya joked that the holiday was getting out of hand, but there was affection in her words. Their family gatherings had always felt warm and balanced. Seeing that photo stirred something in me. It wasn't envy. It was the kind of longing that rises when you glimpse a life that looks like freedom while your own life feels like a carefully constructed cage. I stared at the picture for a long time, imagining the quiet hum of the mountain breeze, the simplicity of a table shared with people who chose to appreciate each other, rather than assign roles and responsibilities that stripped away enjoyment. That evening, while sitting by my window watching the lights flicker across neighboring buildings, I realized that I wanted a Thanksgiving that felt like mine. Whether that meant joining someone else's gathering, spending the day alone, or doing something entirely different, I wanted to reclaim the holiday. It didn't have to look like Maya's version. It just had to feel like a life I chose. The next day, at work, while eating my lunch in the break room, I found myself scrolling through old messages and photos on my phone, looking for something without knowing what. That's when I stumbled upon a text from earlier in the year, a message from a friend named Rachel. She had moved to a lakeside town a few hours south and had invited me several times to visit her, insisting I needed a getaway. Her messages had always been warm, sprinkled with pictures of quiet docks, cup of tea sunsets, and scenes of people gathering around fire pits. I had never taken her up on those invitations because I couldn't imagine slipping away from my family's expectations long enough to enjoy them. But now, for the first time, slipping away didn't feel impossible. It felt necessary. The idea grew quickly in my mind: what if I spent Thanksgiving somewhere else? What if I allowed myself to experience a holiday without the role my family assigned me? The thought filled me with a mixture of fear and excitement, like stepping onto a ledge and realizing that the drop is not as dangerous as it once seemed. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of tea, the steam rising in delicate spirals. I looked around my apartment, a space that, despite its small size, had always felt like an extension of myself. My home was where I felt most grounded, most honest, most capable of hearing my own voice without the noise of expectations. The more I sat there, the more the answer revealed itself. I needed to leave. I needed to choose something outside the script my family had written for me. The decision didn't happen with a dramatic moment or a sudden burst of courage. It happened quietly, with the same stillness that comes when you realize the truth has been waiting patiently for you to acknowledge it. I messaged Rachel, asking if her invitation was still open. She replied almost instantly, delighted and enthusiastic, telling me her guest room was ready anytime. With her message glowing on my screen, I felt a sense of relief I hadn't anticipated. I wasn't running away from Thanksgiving. I was running toward a version of myself I had almost forgotten, a version that had desires, preferences, rest, and dreams not tied to anyone else's needs. The next step was figuring out how to communicate my plan to my family, and that, I knew immediately, would not be simple. My family had built their entire holiday around my presence, not because they valued me, but because they valued the convenience I provided. They would be angry, disappointed, perhaps even accusatory, but their reactions couldn't be my guiding force anymore. If I allowed their disapproval to dictate my choices, I would remain stuck in the role I had outgrown. 2 days before Thanksgiving, I received a group message from my siblings asking if I could pick up a few extra items for the holiday. They listed pies, drinks, extra napkins, and a handful of things that added up to more responsibility than they seemed to realize. I stared at the message for a long time, feeling the familiar tug of obligation. In the past, I would have said yes automatically, grateful to be included even if the inclusion came with a price. But this time, I didn't respond. I set my phone down gently and let the silence hold my decision. Instead of scrambling through stores for additional supplies, I packed an overnight bag. I folded soft sweaters, comfortable jeans, and a coat warm enough for cool lakeside evenings. I added a book I had been meaning to read, a journal, and the quiet evening candle I had bought earlier. As I zipped the bag shut, I felt a flicker of nervousness, but beneath it was something steadier, an understanding that choosing myself wasn't selfish. It was overdue. The next day, the day before Thanksgiving, I took the afternoon off work. I left my apartment with my bag in hand, paused for a moment at the doorway, and let out a slow breath. For a moment, I felt a pull toward the familiar, the instinct to turn back and fall into old patterns. But then I whispered a quiet reminder to myself, change begins with one brave step. I got in my car, plugged in the directions to Rachel's place, and began the drive. As the city streets faded behind me and the scenery opened into stretches of fields and clusters of trees, I felt the tension I had carried for weeks begin to loosen. The sky was painted with shades of orange and pink as the sun dipped below the horizon, and the world around me seemed to expand with every mile I put between myself and the routine that had held me captive for years. When I finally arrived at Rachel's home, the quiet around the lake wrapped itself around me like a gentle embrace. Lights twinkled along the shoreline, reflecting off the water like scattered stars. Rachel greeted me with warmth, showing me to the guest room and insisting I make myself comfortable. The room was simple, a cozy bed, a soft rug, and a window overlooking the lake, but it felt like a haven, where I was not needed, not expected, not relied upon. A place where I could simply exist. That night, as I lay under the soft quilt Rachel had placed on the bed, I listened to the distant sound of water brushing against the shore. For the first time in a long time, I felt myself drifting to sleep without worry. Thanksgiving was hours away, and for once, it truly belonged to me. I didn't yet know what the aftermath at home would be. I didn't know how upset they would be or how they would interpret my absence. But as I fell asleep in that quiet lakeside room, I finally understood something profound. I was no longer responsible for maintaining a version of Thanksgiving that drained me. I didn't abandon my family. I simply chose myself. And for the first time, that choice felt like the beginning of something better. Thanksgiving morning arrived gently at the lake, with soft sunlight slipping through the curtains and laying warm stripes across the guest room floor. I woke to the quiet hum of wind brushing the water, a peaceful rhythm far removed from the clatter and chaos that usually surrounded this holiday for me. For the first few moments, I lay still, savoring the unfamiliar calm in my chest. It felt like waking from a long dream, the kind where you realize you've been carrying tension you didn't even know you held. Here, in this room with its simple comforts, I felt like a person again, not a role, not an obligation, not the designated helper my family had molded me into. Just Nora. A human being with her own desires and her own right to joy. The morning passed slowly, intentionally. Rachel made a quiet breakfast of warm pastries and fruit, and we sat at her small kitchen table overlooking the lake. The world outside looked like a painting, still water, crisp air, leaves skittering across the deck. She didn't press me for details about why I had suddenly escaped the holiday I usually spent at home. She simply offered me space. I realized then how rare it felt to be with someone who didn't require anything from me beyond being present. By midday, the lake community was stirring with its own Thanksgiving rhythms. I could hear faint laughter from neighboring cabins and smell distant scents of cooking drifting through the air. Instead of feeling left out, I felt surprisingly grounded. For once, I wasn't rushing, managing, supervising, or juggling tasks handed to me by people who assumed my time had no boundaries. I made a cup of tea, wrapped myself in a blanket, and sat on the porch watching the gentle ripples move across the water. It felt like I was finally breathing fully after years of shallow breaths. Of course, the moment I turned my phone back on, the peace trembled. The screen filled instantly with missed calls, unread messages, and voicemails from my family. The notifications flashed like alarm bells, but I didn't open anything yet. I placed the phone face down on the porch table and simply sat there for a while, letting the sunlight rest on my face. I knew that whatever those messages contained would pull me into a wave of emotions, and I wanted to meet them from a place of clarity, not fear. When I finally picked up the phone, I started with the texts. The first few were confused and frantic, asking where I was and why I hadn't arrived yet. The next wave shifted in tone, frustration, disappointment, guilt-tinged accusations about not helping, not responding, not fulfilling my usual role. Several messages suggested I had let everyone down, that the kids were restless, that the house was chaotic, that my absence had thrown the whole day into disorder. My mother wrote that she couldn't believe I would do this on a holiday of all days, followed by a long explanation about how hard everything had been without me. I read through the messages carefully, letting each one settle without immediately reacting. They reflected not just frustration, but an assumption so deep it had no cracks, the assumption that I belonged there, serving a function rather than simply attending as family. Each text was a reminder of the role I had outgrown, the role they still believed I occupied. The voicemails echoed similar sentiments, some emotional, some irritated, some sounding as if I had personally caused the day to unravel. Not one message asked if I was okay. Not one message wondered whether something might have been too heavy for me to carry. Not one message recognized that I might have been hurting. That absence in their words told me everything I needed to know. I didn't reply. Not yet. I wasn't ready to open myself to explanations or justifications. I wasn't ready to step back into a dynamic where my needs were invisible. Instead, I kept the phone on silent, slipped it into my pocket, and stepped back inside the cabin where Rachel was seasoning vegetables for dinner. She glanced at me, concern flickering in her expression, but when she saw that I wasn't ready to talk, she simply nodded and returned to cooking. There was something deeply comforting in that, being surrounded by someone who allowed me to exist without explanation. That evening, Rachel's small group of friends gathered for their lakeside Thanksgiving dinner. The atmosphere was warm, unhurried, and sincere. People passed around dishes they had made with care, shared stories, laughed easily, and moved through the meal with a sense of togetherness I hadn't felt in years. And for once, I wasn't tending to children or managing tasks in the background. I wasn't sneaking bites of food or trying to keep peace between restless little ones. I was seated at the table, eating slowly, listening and being listened to. During dessert, as people shared what they were grateful for, I found myself tearing up quietly, not because of sadness, but because I finally felt the difference between being included for who I am and being included for what I do. That difference was staggering. I hadn't known how deeply I needed this, a moment where my presence was enough. Later that night, as I settled into bed, I finally opened the last voicemail. It was from my mother. Her voice was softer than in the earlier messages, not angry or frantic, but tired. She said she didn't understand why I had chosen to be away. She said she felt hurt and confused, but that she hoped I would call when I was ready. There was no blame in that message, only bewilderment. Listening to it made my chest tighten, but not with guilt, with sadness. Sadness that it had taken my complete absence for her to realize something was wrong. The next morning, after a quiet breakfast, I prepared to drive home. The road back felt different than the road there, as if I were returning not to the same life, but to a life I now saw clearly for the first time. I was still nervous about the conversations ahead, but I felt anchored in my decision. I had reclaimed something important, something I had been giving away far too easily for far too long, my autonomy. When I got to my apartment, I spent the rest of the day cleaning and organizing, grounding myself in the familiar rhythm. I lit the quiet evening candle and watched its soft glow fill the room. The scent filled the space, warm and calming, and I realized it symbolized exactly what I had created for myself: a quiet evening, a quiet self, a quiet strength. 2 days after Thanksgiving, my mother asked if she could come by. She arrived alone, carrying a small box of leftovers and a hesitance I rarely saw in her. She didn't raise her voice, nor did she slip into the disappointment-laced tone she often used when she felt wronged. Instead, she sat on my couch, folded her hands in her lap, and listened as I explained how overwhelmed I had been, how ignored I felt, and how I could not continue being the person who filled all the gaps. I told her what I overheard, how painful it was to hear my family plan a holiday that depended on me sacrificing my own experience. To my surprise, she listened without interrupting, without dismissing, without shifting the blame onto me. She apologized quietly, sincerely, saying she hadn't realized how heavy the burden had become. She promised to do better, to ask instead of assume, to see me as a participant rather than a resource. It wasn't a perfect conversation, but it was the beginning of one. My siblings apologized too, in their own ways. They didn't fully understand the depth of my exhaustion, but they understood enough to step back and reevaluate how much they relied on me. It took time for things to settle into a new shape, but slowly, the dynamic changed. I began saying no when I needed to. I offered help when I genuinely wanted to. I spent weekends doing things that filled me rather than emptied me, reading, walking by the water, going on short trips, visiting friends. Most importantly, I stopped waiting for permission to prioritize my own well-being. Now, looking back, I see that Thanksgiving not as the moment I abandoned my family, but as the moment I chose myself with the seriousness and compassion I had always given others. It was the first time I stepped out of a role I had long outgrown and allowed myself to become the person I needed to be. If someone were to ask me what changed that year, I would say this: I finally understood that love without boundaries isn't love, it's servitude. And Thanksgiving taught me that I deserve a life where love flows both ways, where my participation is voluntary, where my presence is valued rather than used. This new chapter feels quieter, steadier, and more honest. It feels like a life where I am allowed to show up fully, not as the helper, not as the backup plan, but as myself. A person worthy of rest, worthy of joy, worthy of care. And that will always be something worth giving thanks for.